And I'm delighted to welcome you to GEM's second webinar in a series that we have decided to run on key findings from the latest GEM national reports. And for anyone out there that has not actually been familiar with GEM in research or otherwise, let me just explain a little bit what GEM is. It's a consortium of national country teams. Some of the representatives of those teams are here with us today that are primarily associated with top academic institutions. And what we do is carry out survey-based research on entrepreneurship around the world. GEM is actually the only research source that collects data on entrepreneurship from individual entrepreneurs. So that's our unique differentiation factor, if you like. And GEM's Adult Population Survey, which we call the APS, you may hear some of the people here today referring to the APS. It provides analysis on the characteristics, on the motivations and ambitions of individuals starting businesses, as well as the social attitudes towards entrepreneurship. We also have another survey, which is called the National Expert Survey, the NES, which looks at the national context in which individuals start businesses. And so this provides us with unique perspectives on entrepreneurship, which benefit numerous stakeholder groups. Academics, for sure, in terms of unique approaches to studying entrepreneurship and to publishing, but also to policymakers, entrepreneurs, our sponsors and partners, and international organizations such as OECD, World Bank, the European Union, and others that we have close partnerships with. So, Kevin, if you wouldn't mind putting up the first slide, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce what we're going to do today. If you just go back one slide there, let's have a look. Today, we're going to it's like armchair traveling in a way. We're going to Chile first, to talk about the conclusions, well, some big takeaways, some gold nuggets, as I call them, from the Chile report. And then we're going to go all the way back in this direction. I'm actually sitting in Switzerland. So we're going to go to GEM Ireland, and talk about the same thing there, the main takeaways from the Irish report. And finally, we're going to look at GEM South Africa. Each of our panelists are going to have 5 minutes, and they will give us, those big headline items. And then we're going to have a little bit of a fireside chat about that. Now, let me just introduce to you who you will be listening to today. I will be modifying the conversation. But our panelists are Professor Dr. Maribel Guerrero. She represents GEM Chile. She's the leader of the team, and she's the professor of entrepreneurship at the School of Business and Economics at the Universidad del Desarrollo in Chile. And then we will move on to Professor Dr. Colm. He is with GEM Ireland. He's the Executive Dean and Professor at Dublin City University. We also have with us a Professor Dr. Natanya Meyer, and she represents GEM South Africa. She's Associate Professor at the University of Johannesburg. And later on for the chat, we will also have another person from the GEM South Africa team, that is Angus Bowmaker-Falconer. He is with Stellenbosch Business School. So that makes for a very interesting conversation today, where we compare and contrast the results, the main results, because of course, we could make a webinar and many webinars on each individual team here, but we're looking at really top line headings, and we're going to have a great and interesting conversation, I think, about these results. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to you, Maribel. Thank you very much for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Aileen, and also thank you so much for inviting me to share these slides and as well as the results related with GEM Chile. And also thank you for all the assistance, because I know that they are taking time for listeners, and as well as we obviously would like to share with all of them several trends that we identified, particularly in my case in GEM Chile. So, before starting, I would like to mention that it's important to notice when we collected the information, because based on this particular schedule, we are able to understand, for example, the main indicators, and as well as, for example, also understand or try to analyze the situation of that indicators for example, in the particular context that we are analyzing. So in general, we usually collect information from May to September. As Aileen mentioned before, we collect in two different sources of information, one focus on adult people, and as well as other focus on experts. So, and based on that, particularly months that we collect information, we are able to capture, for example, all the indicators. For example, when we mention, okay, we create business in, someone create business in the last 3 months, it's like we need to considering that particularly time for considering, for example, when they create. For example, if someone create a business in the last 3 months, it means that if we started to collect in May, that means that the people could be create a business in February, March, or April 2021. So this is important to consider, particularly when we analyze trends and as well as the influence of context. Kevin, please, next. So the next slide. Okay, one of the first trend that we identify, obviously, because we're considering that, well, GEM Chile has participated in the last 15, 20 years of the project. So that means that we have obviously different collection of information. And the first interesting trend is related with the perception. So how the perception of the individuals influence in the decision that they take it in the next indicator. So for the reason is like in the case of Chile, for example, in the context of the COVID-19, was very interesting to see how the people react and how the people consider if they have role models, they perceive capabilities, or they perceive opportunities. So for the reason it's important to considering that, and as well as considering, for example, contrasting with previous years. And this is interesting pattern that we identify, for example, how people are starting to believe that they perceive more opportunities and perceive more capabilities and perceive more role models in the last 14 months after the COVID-19 pandemic. So next, please, Kevin. So the other interesting trend and that we can identify using the APS information is all the entrepreneurial dynamics. So how individuals identify if they have intention, if they are involved in an entrepreneurial activity, or they are involved in a business that, for example, has been involved for more than 42 months in the country. And as well as, for example, if they discontinue business and the reason for why they discontinue that kind of business. But importantly for us is like, for example, understanding how, for example, this dynamic change, because this is a picture every year, but how this dynamic has changed from the last 10 years, 15 years, and particularly when, for example, when we was influenced by the COVID-19 pandemic. And here, the most interesting thing is like, well, one of the most interesting challenges and interesting thing for research is related, for example, how the people can transit from intentions to developing a business, and as well as how that business could be survived during this period to becoming, for example, an established firms. And also this is an important trend that, for example, policymakers considering what, for example, we are capturing information and as well as we are presenting that information to them. Please, Kevin, the next slide. So another interesting important trend that we also identified using GEM data is what are the entrepreneurial strategies that all these business were implementing during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, in this particular case, and how these strategies allow them to survive in this process. And for example, obviously, one of these interesting things were related with innovation, and obviously that was related also with, for example, focus on incrementing, for example, the process of creating more digital business. So, and also it's interesting to see all these trends based on the context that we are analyzing. Kevin, flicks the next slides. And just to finalize, one interesting thing that also we pay attention in countries like an emerging economies and as well as other economies based on the interesting trends of the gender gaps. Here, the information provides us, for example, all the different trends and the different perceptions, for example, that I mentioned before, and as well as all the characteristics that the business that create women and men during this period. And as well as also we can combine and analyze how all these characteristics have been modified and around, for example, for the last 10 years. And also we can identify if this gap has increased or reduced during the period. For example, unfortunately, based on the COVID-19 pandemic, the data show us that, for example, the gender gap increased a lot during that period, particularly in established firms. So the last slide, Kevin. Well, and also it's important to mention that GEM sometimes introduces specific questions for capturing a specific topic like are very important in that moment. Last year, when we captured this information, GEM introduced several questions for relating with the Sustainable Developing Goals. And here also is important because most of the research have been focused on conducting how are the main implications from business when they are developing, and as well as the relationship with the social sustainable goals. So in the particular case of Chile, even that the people don't know nothing about, for example, all the sustainable developing goals implemented by the United Nations, they have been implementing them in their business. For example, most of them considering that social and as well as environmental issues, for example, when they implementing the business strategies and as well as capturing the relationship with the customers. For example, one of the interesting trends here is like, for example, most of the business try to satisfy the customer, for example, trends in terms of supporting, for example, sustainable things. For example, when they for example, buy food, or maybe when they are using, for example, different sources of transportation for supporting the environment. So this is an interesting trend that we identify, and also that, for example, in this case, GM can help us to capture that information. So in general, my main intention from this short presentation is to show how we can use GM data and how, for example, we can help not only, for example, in terms of research, but also, for example, to capture different sources of information that could be useful, for example, for different policymakers. The experience that GEM Chile has is like in every release that we present in the different reports, the Minister of Economics and as well as other different people involved in the government for supporting entrepreneurship participate in this kind of events. And we are able to change and exchange information and work with them together. So that's the point. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Maribel. Hi, my name is Colm. So if I was to pick one outcome or one highlight from GEM 2021 for Ireland, is that despite, I suppose, a very tough external environment, and obviously COVID is familiar to as a global phenomena, but more locally, the decision of the UK to leave the European Union, they're our nearest and biggest market. So Brexit, a significant challenge for the Irish economy. But what GEM 2021 shows us is that we have good and constant levels of entrepreneurship in Ireland. Okay, so that was kind of a positive and a constant from recent years. Now there was a very high level of closures, so a lot of churn in the system, and a quarter of those closures were attributed to the COVID pandemic. So so I think just as a high level factor, that's something that came out from Ireland. I just wanted to make very briefly 3 points focused on 20 years of GEM in Ireland, maybe, as well as in the context of just the recent report. The first is often when we think about GEM, people look for year-to-year differences and see this as a way of engaging with policymakers. But one of the things that's been interesting from a GEM Ireland perspective is that over 20 years, we've had a consistently very positive score on what GEM would describe as sort of the cultural context for entrepreneurs. And that's where the general population's asked a few questions around our entrepreneurs held in high status? Is there good media coverage, stories of entrepreneurs? And is it a good career choice? And that we've scored in the good career choice, about 2/3 of the population generally seeing it as good. But on the other measures, 8 out of 10 people sort of saying, yes, entrepreneurs, it's high status successful entrepreneurship, and that they report seeing good positive stories in the media. And I think it's just important to call out that sort of constant. So, because historically Ireland would have lagged in terms of economic development, and maybe traditionally Irish industry or Indigenous industry underperforms relative to the sort of very successful multinational sector that operates out of Ireland. So that culture, it's just to be able to show that we have it, and it allows policymakers, I suppose, challenge sometimes special interest groups who sort of say we need to do more of this or more of that, and it sort of says, well, actually here we have data to say there is a very positive, supportive environment in terms of culture and cultural context. So that's one point. The second point I just wanted to make is around gender. So one of the highlights of, I think, in the data for GEM 2021 was that we reported the lowest gap, if we use that term, between female entrepreneurship and male entrepreneurship. So a ratio of 1.2 to 1. Okay, so there's still more men engaged in entrepreneurship, but that's the smallest gap that GEM Ireland ever reported. And that's driven by both an increase in the number of female entrepreneurs, and also for 2021 a fallback in the number of male entrepreneurs. Okay, though male entrepreneurship rates are still very high in Ireland relative to, say, European peers. So that's a very positive story. And I suppose from a GEM Ireland team point of view, this is something that we've highlighted from the beginning, and other agencies in Ireland, government agencies, picked up on it and saw the data when we were reporting a much higher sort of gap between men and women, and various initiatives were undertaken. So it's nice to be able to monitor sort of at one step removed, obviously, but to be able to report that increased spotlight on female entrepreneurship by a wide range of bodies potentially has paid off in terms of reducing that gender gap. There still is, though, and this is important, and we do call this out, a gap between growth orientated female businesses or businesses started by women versus businesses started by men. That has also decreased, but in 2006 we reported for every sort of one woman with high growth ambitions, there were 5 men. Okay, and that's halved in the most recent data. Okay, so that suggests not just more women engaged in entrepreneurship, but more with growth ambition. And the third just point I'd like to make around GEM Ireland. So GEM over that period and in the most recent data, as I said, reported positive numbers in terms of nascent and new business entrepreneurs. So the level of entrepreneurship in Ireland. And that sort of always then puts a question back to the GEM Irish team from policymakers is, well, do we need more entrepreneurs? What's the value of producing more if we're scoring relatively well to other countries? And the policy response around entrepreneurship has largely been a much more targeted set of initiatives focused on export-oriented, internationalizing growth potential businesses. So one of the things that we can do with the GEM data is that we report back on that more narrow target. And again, without going through numbers, but we can show policymakers that we perform well on those. But there's a but, we can also say to them that the pool of businesses that they're engaging with is a narrow subset of a much broader set of businesses who fall in, based on the GEM data, into that seeking to grow and develop their businesses. Okay, so they're just some of golden nuggets, I think, Aileen, from GEM Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colm, can I ask you now, Natanya, to talk about South Africa?
Thanks, Aileen and Kevin. And I think I just want to take the opportunity to thank our sponsors, because we know that without these people, it's not possible to produce this wonderful research that we are. So thank you firstly to GEM Global for this opportunity, and then our local sponsors, CEDA and Stellenbosch Business School. So yeah, I think for me and Angus, it was important to sort of set the scene of South Africa, because I know that there's challenges across Africa, globally, especially with the whole COVID pandemic that's hopefully just behind us, but obviously still going to take a while to recover to pre-COVID rates. So this is just sort of a snapshot of some of the challenges that we face in South Africa on a daily basis. And as I mentioned earlier, we're currently sitting with no electricity. My generator is on backup. And this is a huge issue for businesses, especially small businesses, because they don't have the capacity to have these backup power supplies. So generally they close. So you can see we've very realistically illustrated this as a mountain to climb, because we do see it. And it also comes out from our NECI and NES data, which I'll show in the next slide. But I've just sort of highlighted go back one slide, Kevin. I've just highlighted three major things that we really sit with, and where we hope that by improving entrepreneurship in the long run would have a positive effect. And if you can look at the top one, we sit with a youth unemployment rate of 66.7%. That means that 2/3 of our youth are unemployed. And I mean, the magnitude of this is just, I don't think we can even discuss this. So I'm highlighting this because in the next slide that's coming 2 slides from now, there's some positive reaction that's linked to this. Then obviously we are probably the most unequal country in the world. If you look at the Gini coefficient, 63.7, and then our official unemployment rate is 35.3%, although I think it's much higher if you consider other aspects. So there's a lot of other things, but I don't want to linger too much on the negative aspects. I'd rather go into the positive, which is all about the gems. So you can head on to the next slide, Kevin. Okay, so I think in a nutshell, this is sort of a summary of everything that's happened in our last year was 2019, and then the most recent report 2021. So if you have a look at that middle line where the little circles is, that's sort of the baseline of 2 years back. And then the indicators above that is where we saw an improvement, and the indicators below is where we saw a decrease in the 2019 rates. So again, I'm not going to go through each one, but I would like to point out some of the main things that really had a significant increase in the last report. And that is our firstly entrepreneurial intention, which jumped from 11.9% to 20%. Nascent entrepreneurship rate from 7.3 to 10.5. New business ownership rate 3.7 to 7.3. And then our TR went up by more than 7%. And in the little orange block, I just put the baseline of our 2001 TR, which was our first baseline, and that was 6.5. And so based on that, you know, you can see it's almost tripled. Unfortunately, you know, I don't think it's all for the good. I don't think it's all, you know, people starting businesses for opportunity. We know that with the whole COVID thing, a lot of people lost their jobs. So a lot of those new businesses that actually started was based out of no other option. But I think future trends will show us if this was sort of a pop out figure, or if this good trend will continue. Then also the established business rate also went up. But one thing that I think is two things that significantly went down was firstly our fear of failure, which, well, not significantly, but it went down, and it makes sense because people were scared in this times of you know, economic instability, you know, to start businesses. But the main concern, and I really, really hope that this is just because of mostly COVID, was the business discontinuance rate, which went from 4.9 to 13.9%. And if we start analyzing the reasons why businesses stopped, 70% of those were either because of COVID, not being profitable, or not being able to access finance. So three major issues that sort of contributed to a lot of businesses closing their doors in the latest report. Thanks, Kevin. You can move to the next one. Okay, so two of our golden nuggets that I want to point out. As I said, I'm not going to have all doom and gloom. We need to bring some positivity into the room as well. remember I said we have this huge problem with youth unemployment. And if you look at the figure on the left-hand side, my left-hand side, you will see that the orange line, or the orange bar, represents the age group between 18 to 24. And this is basically where we sit with the highest youth unemployment rate in South Africa. Now, again, I just added in the block right to the left of it, where you'll see in 2001, our TR for this age category was 3.4%. I'm not sure if you can all see on the slides, it's very light. Whereas in 2021, this rate increased to 19.3%. It actually surpassed all the other age categories for TR. So, and also the pinkish red line or column is also, that's the age group 25 to 34, which is also still considered youth. Unfortunately, I'm not in that anymore. But anyway, so those two categories increased in TR significantly. And again, I'm really, really hoping that this is not a one-time situation, but that this trend will continue, because I do think that if this trend does continue, that we will have a slightly lower youth unemployment rate in future measurements. Unfortunately, we know this is quite in a lag, and it will take some time before this positive effect in the TR in this youth categories actually has an impact on our youth unemployment rate. Then, as with Ireland, I think, we also had some positive feedback in our female to male ratios. And I think predominantly this is based on a few things. There's a huge media hype about female entrepreneurship and promoting them. And we also have a lot of government policies, support programs, etc., that's specifically aimed at female entrepreneurship and promoting females to enter the industry. I think we're sitting with similar problems. A lot of these female businesses are service orientated, low growth, that type of thing. Not there yet, or not considering themselves into the high growth category, but still, although that is where we want to see them, just having them, even if it's in a lifestyle type of business, I think it's still a positive overall. Thanks, Kevin. Next slide. Okay, so this is just a summary of our NECI, our Entrepreneurial Context Index, that looks at the National Expert Survey. And as you might know, I'm not sure if everyone in the audience is aware or familiar with all the indicators, but this sort of summarizes several framework conditions that we say is necessary for entrepreneurs to actually be successful. So if you can have a look at this figure, you will see that the top line, let me just see, the bottom line is the South African figures, and then the top line with the white dots is actually the GEM average. And this is a score out of 10. Each one is scored out of 10. So unfortunately, South Africa is below average in all of these categories. So there's a lot of work to be done to actually make sure or ensure that there's an enabling environment for entrepreneurs to not only want to start businesses, but for those who actually are in business to be able to survive in this environment. I always say, our entrepreneurs in South Africa, I call them superheroes, because if you have to, on a daily basis, sit with all the challenges that these people sit with, you need to have your Superman cape on, because there's no other way to survive it. And I think, unfortunately, it is reflecting in what we saw with the discontinuous rates, that some people, and I think it was obviously with the whole pandemic, just couldn't survive all of these challenges that they face on a daily basis. I'm not sure if that was the last slide. Maybe you can just check. Yeah, and that was the last slide. So that's all in a nutshell from South Africa. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this wonderful team.
Thank you indeed. We should be thanking you, Natanya, for taking your time today. So thank you. I'm actually going to do a little round amongst the panelists. I'll start with you, Angus. But first, before I ask you a question, could I just say to everybody that you can put your questions in the Q&A area, and we'll pick up on your questions. Either our panelists will answer you directly if it's a very specific or if it can be something that we'll take into the panel discussion, we will do so. But Angus, as you were listening there to all three presentations, was there anything that actually struck you or intrigued you, or that you might like to comment on in terms of the contrasts, the similarities? Any comments in general, Angus? You need to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thanks, Aileen. Yes, no, that was very interesting. Thanks to everyone. That was a good listen. Yeah, I was very intrigued with the Chile, with the very low sustainable development goal knowledge, but yet the business practice was very much for it, and I think that was very fascinating. So, and that must be a culture or a mindset that obviously is endemic to that environment. But so we would have, for example, similar low knowledge on SDGs, but I doubt we'll have the same practices. So it's very interesting. So that was fascinating. From Ireland, it was, the idea of a culture that supports entrepreneurship is a very positive message, because we don't really have that in the same way here in South Africa. So and we have lots of government agencies that put lots of money into it, but we don't have that, that little bit that says it's policy driven. So there's a clear objective to say, we're supporting the culture. We have a supportive culture with a purpose. So that was very interesting for me. We here, and also from Ireland as well was nice to hear that women are getting more either support or access to support and finance to get involved in high growth entrepreneurship. So that was interesting for me. I can't really. What I can say about the South African report is maybe just one thing that was intriguing, that it was very disappointing, the discontinuance rate. However, our established business rate also went up. Now that's very positive, which means there is a throughput. And it's not very high, it's 5.2%, but it's almost 2% up. So that's my comment on the South African presentation.
Very interesting, Angus. I'll come to you in a little while, Natanya, because I'm sure you have your own thoughts to add. But for the moment, can I move to you, Colm, and ask you whether, did you feel you could benchmark in any way with some of those other results, or how did you feel? Anything intriguing for you?
I think, in fact, it's maybe the diversity of the contexts that strikes me, and I suppose as an academic, that's a kind of a challenge for us, because a lot of our research on entrepreneurship isn't drawn from the sort of population basis that GEM is drawing. So a lot of our perceived wisdom around entrepreneurship tends to come from developed contexts and stuff like that. So it is, I think, that's the thing that struck me, that just that reminder that, well, if you have youth unemployment rate of 2/3, that it's just a very different world. It's a very different policy challenge. Yes. And so that was the kind of the thing that struck me most at a sort of an aggregate level. I was curious about very, very high intentions in Chile. I always find the intentions number hard, even in an Irish context. It's high, and there's obviously an intention action gap that's quite significant, but it must be potentially even higher in Chile. And just sometimes when you see a very high number, just how you explain it and how you speak to policymakers about it. But I think the main thing was just the diverse contexts, and that's the strength of GEM, is that it lets us see entrepreneurship in very, very different global circumstances, and yet still be able to discuss and compare.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think listeners will have heard that basically there are different kinds of entrepreneurs. There are growth entrepreneurs, but there are also necessity-based entrepreneurs who during the time of the COVID, we have noticed across the board in many of our countries in developing environments, an increase in necessity-based entrepreneurship. Maribel, maybe you would like to comment on what Colm has just said, and indeed comment on what you heard from Natanya and Colm as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, regarding with the Colm comments, I believe that he's right. Typically, for example, in Chile, we observe like this highest percent of intention and as well as highest percent of entrepreneurial activity. And one of the most interesting reasons behind that is like, well, for one side is like the population belief, and particularly, for example, this year, but the population believe that becoming an entrepreneur is an interesting career, you know, like, for example, like an other kind of career. And most of the explanation behind of that is like most of the people, when we ask them what are the main motivation, is related because they didn't find a job opportunity in the labor market. So as you mentioned, regarding with entrepreneurial opportunities. And also it's very interesting, for example, again, I would like to highlight that we are able to, for example, not only contrast or do benchmarking with other regions that are the reference regions for us, for example, in this case, Latin America or other OECD countries that are interesting to have these patterns, but also, as Colm mentioned, is like we have also the opportunity to see for how other countries have been implementing different policies for supporting the cultural things that, for example, was very highlighted in the presentation that Colm mentioned. And as well as also we observe similarities in terms of the challenges that the Chilean people experiment, like, for example, in South Africa, you know, in terms of the different conditions on the context. I didn't mention nothing regarding with the context, but we also have these different challenges as well as, for example, similar that Natalia mentioned, in terms of, for example, one of the main problematics for people in terms of discontinuity is related with financial issues. You know, obviously, the financial is very important in all the entrepreneurial steps, you know, not only, for example, when you are trying to create business, but also, for example, when you try to survive or to try to have liquidity for developing your activities when you are established firms too. So, and at the end of the day, I believe that the most amazing things from this project is this contrasting and learning from others, and as well as policymakers, not only researchers, because this where we are. This is the perception of researcher, but also policymakers could have like a very interesting learning gems from all these experiences that we have in all the project. And also we can learn, not copy and paste, but also we can adapt. And also we can implement in different strategies and programs that can be very useful in other countries.
Okay, thank you, Maribel. Very insightful. I actually also I was intrigued with this youth in entrepreneurship rate, Natanya, and I see that we do have a question coming in. You know, what do you think can be done to encourage and lure the youth in South Africa to shift their mindsets, you know, in that category from the 25 to 34 years of age, from being employment consumers, that's the way it's framed, to be entrepreneurs, job creators?
Yes. I think I just want to add on to what Maribel said, because it links to what your question is. We are in some way fortunate to have one of our sponsors being directly from the government. CEDA is the a development agency in South Africa that sort of promotes entrepreneurial activity and small business. So they are one of our sponsors and sit on our meetings. And I know that sometimes, you know, there's a gap between the research and the actual implementation or the acceptance of our recommendations into policy or into the governmental aspect of it. So I think we are fortunate to have people from government level that wants to listen. Hopefully, you know, the information that we provide them will sort of flow into better decision making. So I think that's one thing I just want to notice. And then coming back to your question, you know, I think it's a very mindset type of thing. In South Africa specifically, the youth of today are very much thinking that they are going to end up in this big CEO position with a fancy car and a high salary the moment they leave school. And unfortunately, you know, reality hits them quite hard. And this isn't the case. So we have a lot of students or youth people who actually enter university and get degrees, and even they struggle to find jobs afterwards. But I think one of the main issues for a lot of them not relating to entrepreneurship or entering that more often than just being part of the unemployment figure is this environment that I spoke to earlier. It is not easy to start a business in South Africa. There is a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of red tape, a lot of issues. Getting financing is difficult, although there's a lot of finance opportunities available. And this was one of the findings from our report, is that the youth does not, or they are not aware of all the agencies and the opportunities that is actually out there to assist them. So I'm not sure if it's just a form of laziness. They don't want to actually go and do the research to find these places, or if perhaps, you know, the way these agencies communicate is sort of missing this age cohort. So I think there's a combination of reasons, but I think many of this is unfortunately based on a lot of negative socioeconomic aspects we have in the country. You know, to say that I'm employed, let me just start a business, it's easier said than done. So I think the thinking is there, but the doing and the actual implementation is not always there.
Okay, thank you, Natanya. I'm going to turn to you, Colm, actually, because I guess I myself, I'm Irish, as many of you may hear in my accent, and I was part of the generation that left Ireland because basically at that time we had 20 to 23% unemployment in the ends of the 80s. And at that time, I think the entrepreneurship mindset amongst young people was fairly non-existent. So you've been talking to us, Colm, about the fact that you have been part of GEM. Maybe you yourself personally have not been involved with GEM for 20 years, but yeah. Have you? How long have you?
I have, unfortunately, yeah. I'm also outside that youth age category.
Yeah.
So,
well, no better person to talk to then about. Maybe you can share what actually happened in that 20-year period in terms of policy making and shift, so that mindsets actually started to, because I think it's a long-term thing to change mindsets, okay? So what happened? What did the policymakers do? What did the educators do? How did that work?
So obviously this is a difficult one to answer, and different people might answer it or have a different narrative around it. I think an important point, and this I suppose talks a little bit back to that context question. The context in Ireland changed, so the country did get wealthier in the 1990s into the 2000s, both sort of through its own actions and sort of macro policies, and also through an influx of foreign direct investment that over time upskilled itself, so it became more increasingly positive impact on the economy. The policy, if there was one policy thing that might have mattered, is a very significant investment in education. Consistently going back to well, I think always, but certainly into the 80s, into my own university was founded, you know, the late 70s, into the 80s and the 90s. So we've consistently very high participation in education and post-school leaving education as well. So then what you have is an educated workforce and a wealthy economy, or a growing wealth economy, and an economy that's very internationally focused, given the presence of multinationals. I think, I suppose, at a more micro level, you then get success stories. You get people being successful, you'd get businesses who are successful, and then that start spinning out other businesses. So it then becomes very visible. It becomes, it was celebrated, not through any sort of deliberate policy way, but just people liked people doing well, even though sometimes Irish people say they don't like other people seeing other people doing well and they begrudge that. But I think people like that stories and stories of successful people, and success sort of begets success and stuff like that. The more narrow specific policy focus has always tended to be on a niche rather than a broad-based. So it tends to be on these internationalizing, export-orientated types of business, and that's, yeah.
Okay, now here's a question for everyone. Maybe Angus, you could comment. The increase in female entrepreneurship across the board, do you think that this is just because of the hype that's going on nowadays around, you know, women, etc., or do you expect that will, you know, that's a trend that will continue? Is it just, in other words, is it just a blip, or will it continue?
I think we're seeing a lot more in South Africa. We're seeing a lot more venture capital and funding vehicles being driven and run by women. And I think that's going to make the difference, because as you found in the international report as well, you know, decisions around how you invest and how you capitalize are sometimes different when women are running the decision making. So, and they will focus and provide more high growth opportunities for women. So I think that's a positive thing. So we've seen that in South Africa. I think in our case, women are breadwinners, and a lot of our entrepreneurial segments in the TEA segment is necessity driven. So I think we're seeing that as well in terms of women being better represented. So it's a dichotomy. South Africa it has two realities, it has two economies, it has a formal, very smart economy, and it has massive informal economy. So yeah.
Okay, and Maribel, maybe you're the same question. Have you got a comment on that? Because I know that you've been focusing on this issue quite a lot. Yeah, women entrepreneurs, that is.
Yes. Well, yeah, well, for example, last year we with all these people from Babson, we're developing this interesting report that capturing all this information about the different countries and as well as the different challenges. So I would like to highlight this opportunity to invite all the people to revise in depth all these specific monographs. But for example, in the case of Chile, we also faced an interesting trends, because in the past we captured that, for example, that there are interesting, like we can say, a light at the end of the tunnel with the women when they try to create business. So for example, when we interviewed them during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, they show us like several insights about how they try to survive, and try to be persistent. And one of the interesting signals that we identified in that moment is like women try to be more conservative at the moment that they try to invest when they face it, for example, uncertainty times. But also, for example, some of them try to take advantage, because most of them try to, for example, to close or discontinue their business, but started a new business focused with a digital orientation and also with an international orientation. And most of them say that, for example, if they waiting for do that things in a normal times, maybe they are going to spend a lot of money for investing and developing their ideas, And in that particular process, they take advantage of these opportunities that face it related with the social distance, because most of the business that were related with women were affected by and were closed during this period. And they take advantage in that sense. And maybe they started new business that they believed that maybe in the past they didn't thinking that could do it. And as well as, for example, go abroad. And this is an interesting thing that, for example, for them, was interesting. Obviously, most of the time they face these gender issues, because obviously they are facing all the problematics for kids at the same time, and all the relationship with the family balance and work balance.
Mhm.
But I believe that one of the interesting things is like they also believe that they try to transform themselves, but also trying to support this society and as well as based on the business that they developing, you know. And one of the attendants mentioned is if there are several projects that supporting the specific women entrepreneurship in Chile. And I say, well, there are different initiatives, but when, for example, we asking directly to the women entrepreneurs if they are interested to be part of that, they sometimes try to be outside of this initiative because they believe that most of the time is like they can survive by themselves instead of be related with public administration that maybe takes a lot of bureaucracy, and as well as maybe takes a lot of interest to return the money, for example, in case that they receive any support. And this is an interesting issue that maybe they try to maintain outside of the support of the program of the system. But interesting thing is like when we asking them, we try to be consensus that, for example, maybe they take conservative initiatives in terms of, for example, create employments, because they believe that maybe they prefer not create any employee if they are not, for example, are able to support in long term. So, and in that sense, I believe that there are a specific things that we can learn from them.
Okay, yes, and you know, one of the things that I am noticing in the questions is that there is quite a bit of curiosity about sample size and sample size variance as accounting for big changes, and Natanya, particularly in the context of South Africa. I think that might be interesting for people to actually hear the answer to that question. I know you, and by the way, thank you very much, panelists, for answering questions directly, but that one is quite interesting. Would you be able to comment, Natanya? Or
yes, I'm going to also ask Angus to come in here, because I wasn't involved in the data analysis process, so maybe he has an answer. I also did inform the panel, the person who asked to take this offline, and we can maybe give them a better answer, you know, with the information in front of us. But I'm not sure if Angus can contribute more to this specific question.
Or indeed the other panelists as well. That might be some, you might have some comment on that. Yeah. Go ahead, Angus.
So the sample sizes that were drawn across the two periods that I've been involved in are similar in size, similar in shape, similar in structure. So we have confidence that we can talk across them. So I think that's the short answer. And it was conducted by the same external service provider. So we have reasonable confidence that the samples are talking to each other in the 2 rounds that I've been involved in. Yes.
Any comment on that, Colm, yourself? Sample size, variance.
Yeah, sorry, I hit the wrong button.
That's okay, no problem.
Yeah, so our adult population survey has been 2,000 every year over the years, and I suppose it's something that we're always conscious of. Tend to look for trends over time rather than sort of year-on-year changes. So obviously year-on-year changes can happen, and if you think of the economics crisis globally, there were very significant year-on-year changes that were, you know, easy to understand, if you like. But in general, we tend to, you know, try to observe things over time and try to sort of smooth out year-on-year differences just to get trends. But yeah, so that's kind of, I think, the best way of.
That really is the interest of joining GEM. I mean, we're particularly interested in having teams join for, you know, the foreseeable future, if you like, so that over time you will see trend, and you're not actually picking on 1 year and trying to understand the figure in 1 year. What I think has been extremely interesting in the last 2 years, obviously, has been the very obvious impact on entrepreneurial mindset, attitudes, activities of the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly on women. We did have a question actually about older entrepreneurs. Would anyone like to maybe comment on older entrepreneurs and how they have been acting, especially around the time of the pandemic, emerging from that? Who might volunteer? Yes, Natanya, thank you.
Yes, Aileen, I also think I answered that question in the Q&A. So when we look at traditional entrepreneurial trends or what happens in the literature, we normally see that the age categories for entrepreneurial activity is sort of an inverted U. So, you know, it will be lower in the early stages, and then as adults become sort of settled after they studied, maybe had children, maybe settled down, they'll start businesses, and then as they get older, it will decline again. And I think specifically, I'm not sure what the other countries' results were based on the age categories, but in the South African context, this totally flipped around. So I think it's because of all the external things that's been happening, not only, you know, in South Africa, but globally, things are not as they are in the literature or in the traditional theory anymore, because we're seeing a lot of changes. And across all the age categories, we did see an increase in specifically the TR rates, not only from the previous year, but you know, looking at a longer trend. But again, as I said, normally you would see a lower entrepreneurial activities in the older categories and lower age categories, whereas this time around it wasn't the case. We saw the highest activity actually in the two younger categories, but still quite a good activity level in the older ones. I think what also happened with some of maybe the older groups, maybe say here from 50 and up, a lot of them might have gone on early pension because of retrenchment purposes, or a lot of aspects because of this COVID situation. And maybe, you know, they decided to take some of their savings to start up a business or do something like that. So I think there's a lot of, we see the data, but we don't always know the how or the why behind it. And I think, you know, for me, looking at future GEM, I think it could be very interesting to sort of add a little bit of a qualitative aspect to this as well, maybe to try and find out, we see these figures, but why are we seeing these figures? Because this is sometimes lacking in the quantitative way of reporting.
Well, that's a very interesting comment, actually, Natanya, because I, being a qualitative researcher in my background, I feel a lot can be explained, but one has to, you know, also be quite careful about interpreting the results and attributing. So, you know, but it's true that there is quite a story to tell, you know, around these figures, and storytelling, I think, will be a lot more what GEM will do in the future, using its research and actually reaching some conclusions about the why. As you can see there, we've put up a slide which will enable you to contact us should you so wish. I'd like to thank all our panelists today for not only being here, but also for diligently answering the questions. And I know that Natanya mentioned it, in some cases, you may have been asked to perhaps, you know, take the conversation offline, which is, you know, I think a really good thing to do, because there's a lot of detail here, especially for researchers, and there's a lot of qualification that we would have to make on certain answers to certain questions. What's intended here, you know, in these webinars is to give you a little taste, if you like. It's almost like as if you're listening to you're getting the cream of the results of these national teams that are here today, Chile, South Africa, and Ireland. But underneath the cream is a lot of really juicy fruit. And so don't hesitate to go onto our website, find those national reports and investigate further. And above all, if you know you or anyone you know are interested in forming a team in a place where we do not have a team, in a country where we don't have a team, we'd really be interested in hearing from you. So those are all our contacts there. Again, thank you very much to everyone for joining us today. And thank you to Kevin, who made this possible as well. And have a good rest of the day, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Aileen.
Goodbye, everyone.
Aileen.
Thank you.
Bye.